In January of 2019, a wave of Arctic cold rolled into Chicago and the temperature dropped to 19 below zero. And the American Railroad, one of the most powerful freight networks on the face of the earth, essentially fell over. Amtrak canceled every single train in and out of Chicago. 55 trains a day, gone. Rails snapped clean in 3 different places between Baltimore and Washington, and crews were out on the tracks doing something that looked completely insane. They were setting the rails on fire. Now, go to Siberia. At that very same moment, out on the Trans-Siberian and the Arctic gas lines running north of it, Russian trains were rolling along in temperatures of -40, -50, in some places colder still. The Trans-Siberian is nearly 10,000 kilometers of track, the backbone of the entire country, and along one stretch between the stations of Mogocha and Skovorodino, the temperature can fall to -62. That is the coldest railway on the planet, and the trains do not stop. They do not cancel, they just run, the way they do every single winter, in cold so deep it would shatter an American railroad into pieces. So what does Russia know that America does not? The answer is not what you think. It is not that Russians are tougher. It is something built into the steel itself. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We want to know who's out there. Start with why cold breaks a railroad in the first place, because this is the thing almost nobody understands. Steel shrinks when it gets cold. A modern railroad is built out of what is called continuous welded rail, mile after mile of steel welded into one single unbroken ribbon with no gaps. That makes for a beautifully smooth ride, but it creates a hidden problem. When that welded steel gets cold, it wants to contract, to pull itself shorter. But it is bolted and anchored down and it cannot move. So the tension just builds and builds inside the rail. And if it gets cold enough past the breaking point, the steel simply snaps in two. Railroaders call it a pull-apart. The rail tears itself apart from the inside because it is too cold to shrink and too anchored to give. That is what happened in Baltimore. That is what happens across the northern United States every time a real cold snap hits. When a rail cannot shrink and cannot move, the tension climbs until the steel simply gives up and tears in two, leaving a gap where solid rail used to be. If a fatigue crack was already hiding inside that rail, the cold makes it worse, because cold steel can carry less tension before it fails. So the coldest nights are exactly when the weakest rails let go. A pull-apart also breaks the electrical circuit that runs through the rails, which trips the signals to red and stops every train behind it. One broken rail on a freezing night can freeze an entire line. And that is why you saw those videos of American train tracks on fire. The crews were not crazy. When a rail cracks in the cold, or to keep the switches from freezing solid, American railroads literally light fires along the track. Gas-fed heaters, sometimes just a gasoline-soaked rope set alight, to warm the steel back up so it expands enough to be welded or bolted or moved. Switches are the moving junctions that decide which track a train takes, and if ice locks them in place, every train through that spot stops dead. So Chicago's Metro keeps open gas flames burning right on the switches through the worst of it. It looks apocalyptic. Trains rolling through open flames at ground level in the dark. But it is a genuine century-old railroad technique, and America leans on it because when the deep cold comes, America is fighting it off rather than living in it. Here is the key. Every piece of continuous welded rail is installed at a specific target temperature, what engineers call the neutral temperature. It is the temperature at which the rail sits perfectly relaxed, no push, no pull. Set that neutral temperature high, and the rail is happy in the heat but brittle and strained in the cold. Set it low, and the rail can take deep cold without tearing, but risks buckling in summer heat. And here is the whole story in one sentence. Most American track is set up for a climate where summer heat is the bigger enemy. Russian track in the cold regions is set up for the cold. Because in Russia, the cold is not a surprise. That is the entire difference. In Chicago, -19 is a disaster that hits once every few years and wrecks everything. In Siberia, -40 is just Tuesday. And when the cold is permanent, you do not fight it. You build for it. You surrender to it and design everything around it from the very beginning. So, look at what the Russians actually do. On the Arctic lines, the rails and the trains are built from cold-resistant materials chosen to stay tough in extreme cold, rather than the ordinary railroad steel that turns brittle as glass and shatters when it gets cold enough. The whole track is laid on permafrost, ground that is permanently frozen, and instead of fighting that frozen ground, Russian engineers anchor their railroads to it with special thermal foundations designed to keep the frozen earth frozen and stable, because a solid block of permanently frozen ground is actually a rock-hard, reliable base to build on. They turn the enemy into the foundation. The switches, those moving track junctions that freeze solid and shut down Chicago, are heated as a matter of course, all winter, every winter. Not as an emergency, as routine. Snowplow trains work around the clock through the winter months, clearing the lines before the snow can ever pile up enough to strand a locomotive, with crews working in rotating shifts and heated shelters waiting for them. The locomotives run on special diesel fuel blended with a lower pour point, so it keeps flowing instead of turning to jelly in the tank. On the electric lines, the pantographs, the arms that reach up to the overhead wire, are built to vibrate and shake the ice off the line before it can build up and cut the power. And then there is the trick that tells you everything. When the temperature on those Russian lines drops far enough into the deep cold, they do not cancel the train. They shorten it. A long freight gets cut down to a fraction of its normal length. Why? Because in that deep cold, the steel of the couplings and the airlines contracts, and a shorter train keeps the air brake pressure consistent and stable all the way down its length, preventing the failures that a longer frozen train would suffer. They do not stop moving. They just adjust the machine to match the cold and keep rolling. That is the whole secret. Russia did not outmuscle the cold. Russia expected it. Every rail, every foundation, every switch, every drop of fuel on those lines was chosen from the start for a world that is frozen most of the year. America built its railroad for a temperate country where deep cold is a rare visitor, and so when that visitor arrives, it breaks things, and the crews light their fires and fight it off until it leaves. Neither one is wrong. It would be madness for a railroad in Georgia or Texas to build itself for -50 when it will never get close. And it is exactly right for a railroad in Yakutia, near the coldest inhabited place on Earth, to build for nothing else. The cold that stops America does not stop Russia for one simple reason. Russia was never surprised by it. Russia built a railroad that already lives there. So the next time you see a photograph of a Russian train trailing steam through a white Siberian waste at 50 below, understand what you are really looking at. Not tougher people, a tougher plan. A railroad that made peace with the cold 100 years ago, and has been quietly running through it ever since.